schoolbook gives you a hero at the top. A tall man in Washington signs a paper, and the enslaved become free. Except the paper he signed, the Emancipation Proclamation, could not free anyone the day he signed it. It applied only to the areas still in rebellion, the exact places the Union had no power to enforce it. And it left slavery legal in the loyal border states. And the 4 million enslaved were the most valuable property in the country. Property that large is never simply given away. So here's the question this whole thing turns on, and the schoolbook answered it too fast. Who actually freed the enslaved? And why were you taught it was someone else? Sit with just the first half of it for a second. In the year the South seceded, a prime enslaved worker could sell for well over $1,000, and there were about 4 million enslaved people in all. By the economic historians' estimates, they were the largest single category of wealth in the country, their market value taken together running past the combined value of the nation's factories and its railroads. And capital that size does not sit still and wait, grateful to be handed anything. Something had to move first. And by freeing, I don't mean who signed the document. I mean who broke the thing the document only ratified. That is the piece the schoolbook leaves out. And there is a reason it was left out. Hold the question. Who freed the enslaved? And why were you taught it was someone else? Before you can ask who freed them, you have to see what they were. And in 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote the book that shows you. A book the historical profession spent decades pretending it had not read. He calls it Black Reconstruction, and he opens it not with a battle, but with a ledger. Cotton goes from 9,000 bales in 1791 to 5 million bales the year the South secedes. The price of a human being climbs from around $200 early in the century to well over $1,000 at its peak. So this was not some dying institution limping toward its natural end. It was the load-bearing wall of the whole economy, and it was getting richer every single decade. Now sit with the problem that creates. You own the most valuable property in the country. It's human, and it outnumbers you. How do you keep it from just walking off? You can't put a soldier behind every worker. So Du Bois asks who actually did the policing. And his answer is strange. He points to a class of 5 million poor Southern whites, people who owned nobody, and argues that the slave patrols, the overseeing, the daily enforcement, ran through them. And then he sets down the line that reframes the whole arrangement. Du Bois wrote, quote, "There were actually more white people to police the slaves than there were slaves," end quote. Read that again. The system didn't run on chains alone. It ran on recruiting the people just above the bottom to guard the bottom. And it paid them, not in money, but in status, in the feeling of standing on somebody. Du Bois says the poor white took the job because it fed his vanity and tied him to the masters, that he never once thought of himself as a laborer, that his whole ambition was to become a planter himself. And that is the oldest move in the Book of Power. You set the people who do the foundational work to guarding each other, split by a line that pays one side in pride, so neither side ever looks up. So the enslaved were not a footnote to the American economy. They were its foundation, which means their freedom could never have been some small clerical act. It was the most expensive thing in the country, and nobody gives that away. So if freedom on that scale was not a gift anyone could afford to give, then who took it? Du Bois's answer is his boldest and his most contested. And I want to press on it before I hand it to you, because the second you hear it, your own doubt is going to speak first. He calls what the enslaved did a general strike. And the strongest case against him, stated as hard as I can make it, goes like this. A strike is a coordinated act. It has organizers, a demand, a fund, a decision made together to stop. The enslaved had no union hall, no bulletin, no shared plan. And Du Bois concedes exactly this, that the Exodus had no plan behind it, and no single leader out in front of it. Later historians have pushed on the same point. Some argue that what happened was mass flight and survival under wartime chaos, and that borrowing the industrial word strike lends it a coordination the record does not show. On that reading, strike is the wrong word, because it dresses up scattered, desperate escape as organized labor politics. That is the rebuttal, and it is a real one. So set the label aside and follow the thing itself, because the broad pattern is not in dispute. Only the word for it is. As Union armies push south, enslaved people do something specific, and they do it over and over. They walk off the Confederate plantation, and they carry their labor and their own bodies to the federal lines. Not symbolically, in a flood. It starts early. In May of 1861, at Fort Monroe in Virginia, General Butler needs a legal box to put them in and calls them contraband of war, and the flood only grows from there. By July of 1864, a Union count finds more than 113,000 freed people already sorted into wage work, self-supporting farms, and soldiers. And the sentence the whole book turns on is the one that names what they were doing. Du Bois wrote, quote, "The slave entered upon a general strike against slavery," end quote. And then, quote, "This withdrawal and bestowal of his labor decided the war," end quote. I keep circling back to those two verbs, withdrawal and bestowal, because the whole argument lives in the gap between them. They didn't just stop working for the Confederacy. They took the exact labor the Confederacy was fighting to keep, and they handed it to the other side. About 500,000 people, Du Bois estimates, moved this way, and by his count, some 200,000 of the black men who served in federal uniform came out of that movement. Men whose ability to fight, he argues, decided the outcome. And that is the leverage of the worker at the very bottom. The power to withdraw the one thing the whole system runs on. It is not a museum piece. In 2024, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics counted 31 major work stoppages, strikes, and lockouts together, with 271,500 workers involved. The scale is nothing like a war, and I am not pretending it is. What carries across the centuries is only the mechanism, the discovery an economy makes when the people it refused to count stop showing up. So back to the objection I promised to keep. Was it a strike? Grant the whole thing. No plan, no Moses. The word claims more design than the record can show. But the thing the word points at is real, and it's decisive. Roughly 500,000 people withdrew their labor from an economy fighting for its life and delivered it straight to the enemy of the men who owned them. The proclamation mattered. The armies mattered. The law mattered. But none of them had force until that movement of bodies gave them something to ratify. And on Du Bois's reading, which I think holds, that movement is the piece the school book drops. The positive answer the open only hinted at is right there. They freed themselves by the withdrawal and bestowal of the one thing they owned. But if the enslaved won their own freedom, the next question ambushes you. Why didn't it last? And before I answer, I want to give the standard account its full strength, because it is not stupid, and I am about to turn against it. The case that Reconstruction failed is the one the historians of the Dunning School built, and the one the textbooks then repeated for the better part of a century. Within a decade, the interracial governments were gone. Corruption charges shadowed several of them. The Freedmen's Bureau was wound down. Land was never redistributed. And by the 1890s, Black Southerners were being stripped of the vote and pushed back toward a condition close to the one they had escaped. If freedom was won and then lost that completely, they said, the plain word for it is failure. That is the reading almost all of us were handed, and the events it points at are real. And I am telling you, it is still the wrong word, and Du Bois spends the back half of this book proving it wrong. The word failure smuggles in a subject. It says the thing collapsed, as if from weakness inside it. But look at who actually did the dismantling. It was not incompetent Black legislators. It was Northern capital, protecting itself, reaching down to switch the experiment off. Follow the money, because that's how he argues it. After the war, Northern industry consolidates. Railroads, finance, resource extraction, all fusing into what Du Bois calls a new feudalism, based on monopoly, a thing strong enough to run the federal government. And for about a decade, that power actually has a use for Reconstruction, because Black votes in the South keep its coalition in office. But the moment its grip on industry is secure, it has no more use for democracy anywhere. Du Bois names the desertion without flinching. He wrote, quote, "Big business shamelessly deserted not only the Negro, but the cause of democracy," end quote. And notice what that line refuses to do. It refuses to make this only a Southern story, and only a story about race. The betrayal runs straight through the North, and its motive is property protecting property, with race as the lever it pulls. And there it is again, the same machine from the first movement. Go back to that policing count for a second. Back then, the poor white was set to guard the bottom, so nobody looked up. Now, it's the whole freed South set against itself along the same color line, so the men consolidating the railroads and the banks can work in peace. Different decade, same lever. And it's proof that this was theft by property, not by Black voters, is that the corruption everyone pinned on Black Reconstruction was actually a national, both parties bonanza. Boss Tweed's ring alone looted New York on a scale of tens of millions of dollars, and that had nothing to do with who was voting in South Carolina. And the specific tool of the overthrow was the vote. A franchise handed over, then engineered away. And that mechanic did not stay in the 1800s either. On April 29, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Louisiana versus Calais that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act did not require Louisiana to keep a second Black majority congressional district, tightening the test for that kind of claim. Keep it at the general level, and the pattern is still legible. A newly protected electorate, and then the rules that protect it quietly narrowed. An overthrow can become its own too clean story, so watch the edges of it. The end of Reconstruction was not one hand on one switch. It was Klan terror and rifle clubs, a North that grew tired and looked away, courts and rewritten constitutions and stolen elections. Du Bois's move is to call those the instruments, and Northern capital, withdrawing its protection, the hand that let them fall. Accept his ranking or argue with it. Either way, the picture is of a thing taken apart from outside, not one that crumbled from weakness within. And that is why the word failure names the wrong subject. It wasn't an incapacity in the freed people. It was an overthrow, and the freed people were the target, not the cause. Which brings us to the second half of the question, the half most people never think to ask. If the enslaved freed themselves, and Reconstruction was overthrown on purpose, then why does almost nobody learn it that way? Du Bois's answer here is the coldest thing in the book. The falsification wasn't an accident of fading memory. It was manufactured. by named scholars, inside universities, and printed straight into the school books. He shows you textbooks boiling the whole period down to 3 claims. Black people were ignorant, they were lazy and dishonest, and they were to blame for bad government. And then he traces those claims back, not to any evidence, but to a single axiom underneath them. Now, the next sentence I'm going to read is not Du Bois's voice. It's the voice he's exposing. One of the era's most respected historians, John W. Burgess. I'm reading it so the racism can indict itself. Burgess wrote, quote, "A black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason." End quote. That's not a finding. It's a premise. Set down before a single document was ever opened. And every conclusion about black incapacity in government just flows downhill from it. That's Du Bois's whole point. A discipline started from that and then called what came out the other end history. Hold on to that charge, because before the end, I am going to turn it back on Du Bois himself. But finish his point first, because it is the load-bearing one. This is why the version you're hearing in this episode sounds strange to you. A false version was built, deliberately, to make the true one sound strange. And that fight didn't close. PEN America, the free expression group, reports that since 2021, 21 states have enacted at least one law or policy restricting how race, racism, and U.S. history can be taught. And it would be too easy to say that's the same thing. It isn't exactly. Burgess and the school that followed him corrupted the scholarship itself, poisoned the well the textbooks were drawn from. A statute doesn't rewrite the archive. It fences off which parts a teacher can hand a student. 2 different machines pointed at one target, which is the range of stories a young person is allowed to inherit about who built this country and who took it back. So the unfamiliarity you're feeling right now, that's not evidence against the story. It's the last piece of evidence for it, and the whole thing snaps together. The enslaved freed themselves. They were overthrown. And most of us were taught otherwise because the account was engineered to teach us otherwise. So here's the answer, and I'll state it so you can test it. The enslaved freed themselves by withdrawing their labor from an economy fighting for its life. And the reason most of us were taught otherwise is that the history was written on purpose to make them vanish from their own liberation. That's the claim. Now, the contradiction it opens, and I have to point it back at Du Bois himself. The same book that restores the freed people as the full authors of their freedom leans, for a lot of its facts, on the very state histories Du Bois convicts of lying. Books written by men he says were sure, before they wrote a word, that black people couldn't govern. Can you convict a body of scholarship of systematic lying and still mine it for your evidence? He knows the problem, and his answer may not be enough. And the same book flattens the poor white into a single function, an enforcement mechanism, a bundle of racial vanity, which is close to the exact reduction Du Bois condemns when historians do it to black people. To make the freed people whole, he sometimes turns other human beings into gears. The book does not hide it. He wrote that it had become, of sheer necessity, an arraignment. And an arraignment is not a neutral record, so take the sharpest doubt seriously. If Du Bois is right that a mass withdrawal of labor by the people an economy depends on is the decisive act, then the word strike, plan or no plan, names something true, and the school book is the fiction. But if the coordination a strike implies really was absent, if this was flight and survival more than concerted action, then the label may be claiming an agency the record can't carry, and the argument bends toward the very move it set out to oppose, fitting real people to a theory. So let me try to say the deciding question as plainly as I can. It is whether the leverage was chosen or only seized. And after all of it, I lean toward chosen. Because withdrawing your labor and carrying it on foot to the armed enemy of the men who owned you is not an accident. It's a decision. And it was made hundreds of thousands of times over, wherever the war cracked the door open far enough to make it possible. So the next time you meet the tall man and the signed paper, keep the question in your pocket. Who freed the enslaved? You already know the schoolbook's answer. Now you know the other one, and you know why it was so much harder to find.